Oil just broke $100 a barrel. But the real story is not the price spike, it's the reason behind it. Roughly 20% of the global oil supply normally moves through the Strait of Hormuz every day. But right now that flow has all but stopped. If even one of these disruptions expands, the global oil market could face its largest supply shock in decades. But according to several emerging developments over the weekend, this may only be the beginning of a much larger energy shock. First, the reopening of the most important oil shipping route in the world may take far longer than expected. And third, the risk of attacks on shipping in the Red Sea is rising sharply. They point toward a prolonged disruption in the global oil system, possibly the largest in modern history. The most important oil choke point on Earth. The global oil market depends heavily on a single shipping route. Roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day normally pass through this strait. That represents about 1/5 of the total oil supply in the world. They pass through this corridor before heading toward energy markets in Asia, Europe, and beyond. And that is exactly the situation markets are now facing. Many traders initially believed the disruption would be temporary. Overnight, the United States Maritime Administration cancelled a warning advising vessels to avoid the strait, because several critical steps have not yet happened. There has been no confirmation from the US Navy that the waterway is secure, and there is still no naval convoy system to escort oil tankers through the region, which means that even though the shipping route technically exists, it remains functionally constrained. But what happened next over the weekend may be even more important. Tankers, ports, naval operations. But over the weekend, the conflict entered a new phase. This marks a major escalation in the war. The Israeli Defense Forces have indicated that additional strikes could follow. Oil fields, refineries, and export terminals are incredibly complex industrial systems. That means a single strike can remove supply from the market long after the fighting ends. But there is another risk as well. If that happens, the disruption could spread far beyond Iran itself. At that point, what began as a shipping crisis would become something much larger. But even that might not be the most immediate threat. A few thousand miles away from the Persian Gulf lies another critical shipping corridor. The group at the center of this threat is the Houthi movement. Why does this matter? Because the Red Sea hosts one of the only major export routes that bypass the Strait of Hormuz. That system is known as the East-West Pipeline. Instead of exporting oil through Hormuz, this pipeline carries crude across Saudi Arabia to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. Volumes have climbed to roughly 2 million barrels per day. Even with technical adjustments, the pipeline can only move around 3 to 4 million barrels each day at maximum capacity. That is only a fraction of the oil that normally flows through Hormuz. And if attacks begin targeting shipping in the Red Sea, even this alternative route could come under pressure, which would remove one of the few remaining escape valves in the global oil system. At that point, the scale of the disruption would become historically significant. The largest oil shock in modern history? Some analysts are already referring to the current crisis as Gulf War III, and the reason is simple. The disruption now affects roughly 20% of global oil supply. That is an enormous number. To put it in perspective, the Suez Crisis disrupted roughly 10% of global supply. That event triggered one of the largest oil shocks of the 20th century. The current disruption is already twice that size, but the scale of disruption is not the only difference. What makes this crisis uniquely dangerous is something most people rarely think about: the spare capacity problem. In previous oil crises, markets had a powerful stabilizing mechanism: extra production capacity elsewhere in the world. When supply disruptions occurred, other producers could increase output. This helped stabilize prices and restore balance. During the Suez Crisis, spare production capacity was estimated at around 35% of global supply. Even during the 1973 oil crisis, several major producers still had the ability to ramp up output. But today, that cushion has largely disappeared. Most of the world's spare production capacity sits in the Persian Gulf, specifically in countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And those producers are now located inside the disruption zone, which means the global oil market has lost its primary shock absorber. Without spare capacity, the market cannot quickly respond to supply disruptions, and that forces the system to adjust in other ways. How the market adjusts. Without spare capacity. When production cannot increase, the burden of adjustment falls elsewhere. One option is government intervention. Countries that belong to the International Energy Agency may release emergency oil reserves. These reserves include systems like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. But there is a limit to how much these reserves can accomplish. Strategic reserves are temporary tools. They can smooth disruptions for a short time, but they cannot replace a long-term loss of supply from the Persian Gulf. Eventually, the market must adjust in a more painful way, through demand destruction. When oil prices rise high enough, consumers begin to reduce consumption. Air travel declines, industrial activity slows, drivers use less fuel. This painful process gradually restores balance between supply and demand. But it comes at a cost. Higher inflation, slower economic growth, and sometimes global recessions. Oil prices are already moving, though. We are already beginning to see the market respond. Brent crude has surged above $100 per barrel. Front-month contracts briefly touched $114 over the weekend. Some producers are also beginning to cut output. Iraq has reportedly reduced production significantly. And Kuwait, whose exports depend entirely on the Strait of Hormuz, may halt shipments entirely. Combined, these disruptions could remove roughly 5 million barrels per day from global supply. Even after shipping resumes, production will not return immediately. Restarting oil fields and restoring export logistics can take weeks, possibly longer. Which suggests tight markets through the coming months. But oil is not the only market under pressure. There is also the LNG shock. The global natural gas market may be even more vulnerable. One country sits at the center of that system. Qatar. Qatar is responsible for roughly 20% of global liquefied natural gas supply, and its exports rely heavily on shipping routes through the Persian Gulf. Since the crisis began, Qatar has halted LNG shipments. That decision alone removes a massive portion of global gas supply from the market. If the disruption continues, gas inventories in Europe and Asia could tighten rapidly, and prices could surge, which means the energy shock now unfolding may extend far beyond oil. Which regions are most at risk? Not all economies will feel the impact equally. The region most exposed is the Indo-Pacific. Countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and India import large volumes of oil from the Persian Gulf. These economies rely heavily on maritime supply routes and have limited domestic energy resources. Europe faces a different problem. The halt in Qatari LNG exports could tighten gas markets. Countries such as Italy and the United Kingdom could feel the pressure most acutely. Germany may be somewhat better positioned today than it was during the 2022 energy crisis. But even there, higher energy prices could ripple through the economy. So what is the bottom line? The crisis unfolding in the Persian Gulf is no longer just a geopolitical story. It is a structural shock to the global energy system. 1/5 of global oil supply is caught in a conflict zone. Spare capacity has largely disappeared. Alternative export routes are limited, and the world's most important energy choke point remains unstable. Until the Strait of Hormuz is fully secured, global energy markets will remain on edge, and oil prices will likely remain elevated. Because what we are witnessing is not just a temporary disruption, it may be the beginning of the next global energy shock,